Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Craig and I'm a software developer in the UK, and in this video we're going to take a deep dive into forms in HTML. Forms bring us lots of interactive elements that we typically find on most modern web pages, and these interactive elements include password fields, checkboxes, buttons that we can click, and drop-down menus that allow us to choose from a series of options. There's so many different things that you can do with forms. It's a really big topic, so we're going to spread this one out over a couple of videos. Just know for now that forms are an essential part of any website and one of the most important web concepts to learn. Forms are one of the main places of interaction for users of our sites and are a familiar part of everybody's experiences on the web. In this first video, we're going to start with what forms are, what they do exactly, and where we can find them out on the web. You know them well already, and you'll recognize them when you see them. We'll also briefly talk about how forms work, then we'll learn about our first form fields brought to us by the HTML input element, which comes in various and differing input types. Some of these input types that you would be familiar with already are email input types and password input types, and these are what we would call textual inputs, fields on a web page into which we would enter text of some kind. And in the next video, we'll look at clickable input types, like submit buttons, checkboxes, and drop-down menus. Before we get started, if you like the content on the channel, please remember to smash that like button, subscribe, and comment, as it really helps with YouTube's algorithm. And that being said, let's get started. Okay, so let's pop over to W3 Schools, and we see that they say the HTML form element defines a form that is used to collect user input. A form contains form elements, and form elements are different types of input elements like text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, submit buttons, and more. Okay, so that's useful to know, and it helps us build a picture in our minds, but where might we see some forms out in the wild to take a peek at? Some website or web application where we can enter data into a field and click a button of some sort to send that data somewhere and wait for some response. Maybe we log into something or just get some data given back to us, which is the result of our query. Well, one obvious example that springs immediately to mind is Google Search. Google's search engine is a form, and we see that by inspecting it with DevTools. We use this particular form to send a query to Google, and they send us back some data that hopefully helps us out. So we get, remember this word for later on, so that's we get or we request information. We are using the form to get something back. You can also use a form to log into, say, Facebook or Twitter. This time, rather than getting something, you are sending something, namely your login credentials to be authenticated. If you send the right info, then you're in. So this time we are posting data, so what we do is we get or we post. You would also use a form to edit your personal settings inside Twitter and Facebook, to tweet or post to your wall, or to comment on someone else's post. You use forms to opt in and out of promotions or mailing lists, or when we enter payment details into Amazon or eBay, for example. There's even a decent chance that you used a form to find this video on YouTube if you used the search bar. A lot of traffic to this channel comes from organic searches from within YouTube. Somebody might search something like how to build an HTML form, and Google will send back what it thinks are the best options to satisfy that user's request, one of which might be this video. So the list of the varying uses of forms goes on and on. So let's examine all of this further, and we'll take a look at a form on Facebook, the user login. I have that open here, and I'll right click and inspect. I'll dock DevTools to the bottom and drag the HTML panel up so that we can see what's going on. So we have a form which is all of this stuff here, and what we're interested in is this here, here, and here. We have a couple of text inputs and a submit input. So it has its form tags that are opening and closing. But interestingly, you see that Facebook is using a table inside of the form to help with the layout, and Facebook are then putting the form elements inside table data elements, which is incredibly bad practice, as I said in the last video that we looked at on HTML tables. There are so many better ways to achieve this with CSS, say using Flexbox for example, which of course we'll cover in the CSS section of videos. This is a relic from the early days of Facebook that nobody's ever corrected, so there you go. That's one thing that you could suggest as an improvement if you're ever interviewing for a front-end role at Facebook. I have an article here which explains why using tables for layout is bad practice, so I encourage you to give that a read, and more importantly to avoid doing it yourself. Anyway, we have table rows for the text above the username and password fields, and a table row for the form inputs. Then when we click login, it submits the entire thing. We see it's an input that has a type attribute called submit. The other inputs have type attributes with different values, and these are email and password respectively. If we go to the opening form tag, we see it has this attribute called action, and this tells us where the form data is being sent when you press that button to submit the form to Facebook. So here it is being posted to this page at this really long URL somewhere within Facebook. When Facebook receives the data, they will attempt to authenticate it against the details they hold for the account in their database. If it matches, then you enter the site. Okay, so let's hop over to VS Code, and as we've seen, the form element uses a set of form tags, and anything nested inside of these form tags is part of that form. Think of the form tags as a container of sorts for the various kind of inputs that will be associated with the form, such as password and email inputs, submit buttons, and so on. Form tags have two important attributes, so let's add these in. These are necessary because when you've filled out your form and you're happy with it, then you'll submit it. So you'll either send, or as we said, post data, or you'll request, or as we said, get some data. These two attributes that we'll add now will handle this. The first of these is the action attribute. Every form has an action attribute which determines where the data you enter into the form will be sent. The value of the action attribute would usually be something like the URL for a page on a server that will receive the information when it is submitted. So again, the action attribute handles where to send the info entered into the form once the form has been submitted. The second attribute that we'll use is the method attribute, and this determines the HTTP method. So if action tells us where, then method is going to tell us how. As we said, forms can be sent by one of two methods. We could either have method equals get or method equals post. Get means that when we send the form, we are requesting that we want to get data from a specified resource. For example, if you're searching for the latest Beyonce video on YouTube or new documentaries on Netflix, then you're asking the form to send some data for you, package it up, and send back what you want. The post method is for posting or sending data. For example, when you log into Twitter, you're posting your info to Twitter, who then check it against details in their database. If the credentials match, you're in, and if not, then you'll have to try again. I just wanted to touch on this so you can form an idea of what's happening when we submit a form, where it goes and how. We will go over all of this in much more detail later on, as we're going to be covering HTTP and authentication down the road, so there's no need for us to really fret about this kind of stuff right now necessarily. Let's just make a mental note that forms usually have two attributes, the action and the method. Our action is where the info you've added to the form goes when we submit it, usually a URL on the back end. Our method defines what happens next, basically, if we're posting or sending data, or if we're getting or requesting some. Okay, so we have our form tags in place and our two essential attributes. So now we're ready to start adding some form elements. Before we do, however, I'll just point out that the forms that we're going to make will be functional, as in you'll be able to interact with them by clicking submit buttons and entering data and selecting options from drop-down menus, but the data that we enter into the form isn't going to go anywhere just at the moment, as we don't have a back end. When we submit forms and have them send or request data, all of that happens on the back end with a programming language like Python, PHP, or JavaScript with Node.js. We're using a markup language currently with HTML, and data transfer is beyond the scope of HTML. So we can use HTML to display elements, sure. We'll learn CSS to style them after the HTML series of videos, but to process the form data and to have that data persist in storage, that is done by a programming language, and it is much too early on for us to discuss that just at the moment. So for now, we're just going to take a look at creating presentational forms, and we'll learn about how and why we use the different form elements. The most common form element that goes inside the form tags is the input element. This is an empty element, meaning that it is made up of one self-closing tag. Input tags usually have an attribute which specifies the kind of input that it is going to be. This attribute is the type attribute, and the value differentiates one input type from another. We have some wildly different input elements available to us, and all that separates them from one another really is the value of the type attribute. That's it, and you'll see that in action now. The first kind we'll look at is the input type text. So if we manually add an input tag without any attributes specified first, then we get this text box. And this text box is the default option if we fail to specify the type of input that we want. Browsers will always default to this input type that we can write in. And this is actually the text input, so the input that has the type attribute with the value of text. So if I save, we see that nothing has changed. We specified type is text, and we have the same input element that we had before when we had not defined a type. So input without any type attribute added will give you a type of text. As there are many and varied input types, as I mentioned before, it is still good practice to explicitly define the type when it is text. Another developer might look at your code and miss it at a glance, so best practice is to specify that this is type of text, even though we don't need to necessarily. The problem that we have at the moment is, though we do have a form here with some input, nobody would actually know what it was for. So there's a couple of other things that we need to do to make this user-friendly, to make it intuitive. The first thing that we can do is to give our input some placeholder text inside the input. That's the grayed out text that you see here on Facebook, for example, where it says create a new account. A placeholder gives a short hint describing what to use the given inputs field for. The second option is to give our inputs labels, and this is this stuff here above the login form that is labeling each field. So let's have a placeholder that says something like username, and we do that with a placeholder attribute, and the value that we give that is the grayed out text that appears in the input. We'll save that, and we have our placeholder text. You'll notice that as soon as we start typing our first character, the placeholder is cleared and returns when the input field is emptied. Let's duplicate that input element, and this time we'll have a type of email. So I'll replace the type equals text and the value of the placeholder with email. Type email is an input field which requires the text to be entered in an email address format. Where the text input requires a string of text, this input requires a single properly formed email address. This doesn't necessarily mean that an email address has to exist, but in simple terms this will mean username at somedomain.com or .co.uk or .io or whichever extension. Later on, once we have a submit button, I'll show you that if you try to submit a form without this proper format, it will give you a warning and the form will not submit. Before that, let's make another textual type, and this time we'll have an input with the type of password, which defines a password field. Again, we'll give it a placeholder attribute, and this time saying password. So I can enter my username as Craig, email as craig@domain.com in a proper email format, and when I come across to the password field, you'll notice that what we enter here is concealed to protect the password. So these cover the three common textual inputs, and this shows us how they all differ slightly. You're familiar using all of these online, and now you know exactly how they're created. Okay, so one last thing that we can add to our inputs is a label, and at the moment these are all just floating boxes, but we can label them like we saw on the Facebook login form, using the label element which provides this text before each input. The label is not only visually associated with its corresponding input on the page, but it is programmatically associated with it too. And to make the association between a label and an input element, you need to give the input an ID attribute. The label will then need a for attribute with a value matching the input's ID. Alternatively, there is another way to associate an input and a label. You can nest the input directly inside the label, in which case the for and ID attributes are not needed because the nesting makes the association between the two implicit. There is some debate around whether the label should go before or around the input element, and this link from the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the main international standards organisation for the World Wide Web, says the label itself may be positioned before, after or around the associated control. So that doesn't really clear anything up. So you can place them how you like really, with the label before, after or around the input element. I don't think I've ever placed a label after an input, but during my videos you may see me use the label before the input, and you may also see me nest the inputs within the label. It's just a matter of personal preference, so either do what works for you or follow the convention or style guide set by your school or workplace. Between the label's opening and closing tags, we can add some text like username or password or email, which will display on the screen, making it much clearer for our user to see what each input is asking them to do. Like here at the Amazon sign-in page, if we inspect, we see these are both labels. So let's examine the top label for the email. We see a for attribute in it, and this is saying the label is for something called AP_email. If we look underneath at the input element, we see that this input has an ID also of AP_email. We usually give a label a for attribute, which specifies the form element that a label is going to be bound or attached to. So here we see the label for the email is attaching itself to the email input. So let's pause on this and head back to VS Code. So we have our three inputs and we're going to need to give each of them a label. To make things a little clearer, I'm going to add some comments to mark out the inputs for text. Then we'll have email, and finally we'll have password. I'll comment those simply by going to the line I want to comment and hitting Command and / on Mac OS, or Control and / if you're on Windows. Now we have the comments, we can add our labels. I'll need multiple cursors, which I do simply by clicking and holding Command on Mac or Control on Windows. You can find more on keyboard shortcuts here in the VS Code docs, and I'll leave the link in the description for you. You can also use Emmet shortcuts to write code much quicker. If you haven't seen the video that I did on Emmet, then please check it out. It will help you out a lot and help you speed up your productivity. So I'll show an Emmet shortcut now. We have our multiple cursors and we can type label, hit tab, and Emmet builds out the label element that we've been talking about. We see it has an opening and closing tag, so follows the general rule of HTML. And it also has this for attribute. Remember from earlier that a for attribute specifies the form element that a label is going to be bound or attached to. So for the username label, I will say for equals username. And that's the first step of the process in adding a label. And next I will give the input an ID attribute, which has the value of username also. Now the label and the input are bound. I'll also give the label some text content of username. One more attribute we can add to our text input for the username is the max length attribute, which allows us to specify the maximum number of characters a user can enter. I don't know why exactly, but there is a default value set on our input fields, and that is 524,288. And if you had a decent typing speed of 75 words per minute, it would take you just under 5 days before it wouldn't accept any more characters. And yes, I am nerdy enough to have done that calculation. So if we add a max length of 15 and then type something into the username input, say ABCDEFGHIJKLMNO, it will not allow us to type beyond the 15th character, which in this case is the letter O. So trying to type P or any other character doesn't do anything. Next, we'll add for email and the ID of email, and the for password and the ID of password applied to the password input. Lastly, we'll add the label text to go on the page for each of these as well. And if we save at this point, we see that our inputs are now correctly labelled. You'll notice now that if you click on a label, it has the effect of highlighting or focusing the inputs field associated with the label. So linking the label and the input with for and ID gives it some extra functionality. It makes them programmatically bound. So without them linked, that functionality is not there. We can also have nested labels, as I said earlier, and if we head over to MDN, we see that they tell us that the for and ID attributes are not needed because the association is implicit. So we could have our label, which I'll write out with Emmet, and then inside that goes our input. As MDN tells us, we do not need the for attribute, and we do not need to add the ID to the input. These are bound as is. I'll just add a comment that says input nested in label, and I'll also comment out the whole label and input as we don't need it on our page, but I'll leave it there as a reference for you to refer to if you wish. Another form element that isn't an input type actually, but is similar to those that we've seen above, is the text area element. This is used to create a multi-line text input, like a comment section, for example, where we want to enter longer textual content into a form. So with Emmet, we'll create a text area element by typing TEX and hitting tab. And again, this is nested in our form, so is part of it. We have the elements built out, and let's save and see what it gives us. We see that we have this large box or text area that we can enter text into. To create a bit of room between our password input and the text area, I'll add a BR tag, which gives us a line break, and you see that it gives us some breathing room in the browser. Obviously, we'd space these elements on the page using CSS normally, but as we aren't working with CSS currently, the line break is a good stopgap for now. So I want to add some longer text to put in the text area element. So I'll go to the bottom of the file in the text editor, and I'll just make 30 words of lorem ipsum placeholder text using the Emmet shortcut of lorem, and I'll paste that into the browser, and we see that it can accept an unlimited number of characters and multi-line sections of text. It's also interactive, and we can drag it around on the page to resize the text area if we happen to be typing text that doesn't fit inside the box. This might be preferable if we don't want to have to scroll up and down when we are typing like so. You'll notice that the text area element has opening and closing tags, and any text that you place between the opening and closing tags will appear in the text area itself. Unfortunately, the user will have to delete this before they can enter any text of their own, so a better option would be to give it a placeholder attribute like we did with the input elements above. That will disappear, of course, as the user starts to type something. We have the ID attribute here, which again, like the input elements, allows us to bind it to a label. So I'll add a label above, and then I'll create multiple cursors, and I can put the ID and the for attributes in the label as text. We'll also add the label text of add a comment. The name attributes we'll delete and disregard for now, as this is something that we'll discuss and learn about in the next video. The cols and rows attributes help us to set the initial display size of the box by defining a number of columns and rows. We would be better off, of course, using CSS to define this, but we're not using CSS presently, so these attributes help us out. We could have cols of 40 and rows of 5, or even cols 70 and rows 50 for a really big box. Or go back to where we started with cols of 30 and rows 10. Okay, so we'll leave it there for this video, guys. To recap, we began by looking at forms on the web, and forms are one of the most important HTML concepts and are one of the main sources of interaction for users. We learned where we would find forms in the wild on the web, and also what forms do exactly. Essentially, they allow us to collect some data from users which we use for varying purposes, like authenticating for login purposes, for example. We then spent the second half of the video concentrating on the HTML form input element and the variation given to us by the type attribute that we add to inputs. In the next video, we'll see even more variation as we begin to explore form inputs which are not text-based. We specifically focused on textual inputs in this video, like type equals text, email and password, and we also looked at text areas, which give us large areas to enter longer pieces of text, say some feedback or some comments of some kind. And we also looked at the label elements, which allows us to label our inputs to make the purpose of a given input clearer to users. In the next video, we'll be moving on from text-based inputs, and we're going to look at what I would call clickable inputs elements. And these include checkboxes, radio buttons, drop-down menus, and submit buttons. And all of these are common and important features of any form on the web. So thanks for watching. I do appreciate your time. Remember to sub to the channel and smash the like button. The next part has gone live at the same time as this video, so hop on over to that now by clicking the link on screen now, and let's dive into these clickable input elements. So see you in the next video.